Greetings and welcome, everybody, to another edition of the Psych Monologues. I am Dr. Ray Mitsch, your host. I'm glad you could take some time out of your day to listen to a podcast like this. I know you have lots and lots and lots of alternatives to choose from that are probably way more profound than anything I might have to say, but hopefully this will be helpful to give you something thought-provoking for your day and even your week to think about it. So what is the Psych Monologues? It's a podcast that is exploring the intersection of faith, psychology, and spiritual formation. It is a outgrowth of ministry, a organization that's part of a larger one called SGI, Stained Glass International, and Stained Glass International's got a larger mission than just the podcast. The podcast is certainly the voice of SGI, but the overall mission is to equip, empower, and encourage the next generation of Christians to live authentically in relationship to Jesus, others, and themselves. And my desire in creating this organization, which I've done before, and I've never been entirely sure if it was it was right on target. I don't know how else to put it. And I have increasingly over time been more and more convinced that there needs to be some voice, if you will, that resonates with what the younger generation is talking about. Now, I don't know. I can't exactly get all of the demographics of my audience, so I don't know who it is I'm talking to. I'm hoping I'm talking to more of the younger set, even though you've already seen some videos. I'm a lot older. I think realistically I straddle the two generations, actually, because I teach the younger one and I live in the other one. But I feel like an outcast in both in a lot of ways. That's not to provoke any sympathy or anything. But what I want to do as a result of SGI is to develop what I call outposts for the heart and communities for the soul. And the one thing I've noticed in the younger generation, a lot of times people refer to them as Gen Z. Who knows, what the moniker is that belongs there. But the one thing that's common to all of us is to want to be in a place, even a group of people, that it's safe to take off our mask and our armor and be known as we are. And we have a hard enough time doing that with ourselves. I understand that. At the same time, I still long to be seen, and yet I hide from being seen because of all of the time I spend with myself. And most people will say, I am always my worst critic. Well, okay, now what that means is you're walking around every day, 24/7, with your critic chirping in your ear about all the things you should have, could have, would have done, and things would have been differently. The funny thing about it is the critic is always right because it's always commenting on things that already happened. So, with that, that's what Stained Glass International is meant to be and to accomplish. And Stained Glass has a bigger story behind it. I'm not going to take the time tonight to talk about that, but I think it's an important one that I have talked about in bits and pieces. If you're interested, you can go back into some of the presentations on my website and see some of the lectures I've done around that concept of what I call the stained glass self. But in the meantime, pull up a chair, get comfortable, relax. If you're driving, like I said, keep your hands on the wheel, eyes straight forward, and listen. But let's talk about those things that really matter to you. And that's my prayer and my effort, is to keep my fingers on the pulse of what really matters. And I can tell you from having sat and talked to people in a counseling setting for 40 years that a lot hasn't changed. A lot has, particularly in terms of the thing that I want to talk about tonight. But a lot hasn't changed. Our desire for being known as we are, otherwise known as truth, our desire to be able to trust the people around us, and our struggles with trying to control everybody else around us and everything that oftentimes most everybody is going to say is out of their control. And trying to figure out, where do I end and somebody else begins in terms of my responsibility. And another issue that came up and keeps coming up is the issue of forgiveness, repentance, and reconciliation, which I just finished talking about in the last 3 episodes. And so the next one, the other one that always comes up inevitably is conflict. How do we handle conflict? How do we avoid conflict? Actually, we're probably far more creative in avoiding conflict than we are in terms of moving toward it, partly because we've just gotten a lot of bad examples to work from, and we just assume that those examples will repeat themselves. And ultimately, the thing that comes up is intimacy, and that's that whole thing of being known as we are. So, pull up, like I said, get comfortable. Let's take some time to talk about what I think it. And let me give you some background and some context to this, because I have been mulling this thing over for quite some time. I talk about it in terms of control, but this captures more. And part of the reason that it's done that is I have a group of students that have bravely and courageously signed up for a class that I've never taught before, and it is lovingly referred to as a capstone course. A lot of times, what holds an arch together is the capstone, and I think all of us at one point or another feel like we're waiting for that stone to fall on us because of how this whole thing is laying out. But as a part of that, I have been reading a book by Henry Nouwen. In the Name of Jesus is what it's called. It's Reflections on Christian Leadership for the 21st Century. Now, realize that when he wrote this book, I believe, let me just check real quick, but I believe this copyright was 1997. So it was 26 years ago, and he was looking into the next century in terms of Christian leadership. And he said something that caught my attention, and quite honestly, it just absolutely set my brain on fire, if that's even possible. And as it has done that, it has sharpened my understanding and my sight of how we tend to see things and the impact that it has on us. And the thing that I read that kind of lit the match, and then I'll go off on more of what I have in mind here. But the thing that lit the match for me is something that caught my attention, because I am painfully aware of this generation of Christians walking out on their faith, completely walking out on their faith. And I will tell you, just a plug, if you're interested at all in this, is that on the Chosen podcast, they did a documentary with Gen Z. It's called Gen Z Unfiltered, and how this group of Gen Zers watch The Chosen. They watched the whole first season. But what caught my attention was Henry Nouwen saying this in 1997, okay, looking ahead. And he said, when I asked myself the main reason for so many people leaving the church during the past decades in France, Germany, Holland, and also in Canada and America, the word power easily comes to mind. And he goes on, one of the greatest ironies of the history of Christianity is that its leaders constantly gave in to the temptation of power, even though they continued to speak in the name of Jesus, who did not cling to his divine power, but emptied himself and became as we are. Now, one last thing, one last quote. I'm not going to bore you with a bunch of stuff from this, but the one last quote that absolutely just cinched the forest fire was, "What makes the temptation of power so seemingly irresistible," he asks, "maybe it is that power offers an easy substitute for the hard task of love. It seems easier to be God than to love God, easier to control people than to love people, and easier to own life than to love it." And my jaw dropped. It absolutely dropped. And I began thinking in a bigger context of the stuff that I have talked about with control. Now, I will say power is a bigger subject, and a subset of that is control, because control is a strategy, right, to manage power. But we live in a world whose language is power, and we see everything through that lens. We don't even know that the lens is there. And that's what I want you to keep in mind as I'm talking through this, because it's like your sunglasses. Now, we like sunglasses that allows us to see the landscape around us accurately, but there is a natural distortion by what we see, and that's the way they're designed, right? They're supposed to take out, infrared A and B. Is that right? Not infrared. Whatever the radiation is. It takes both of those out of the light so that we're not harmed, our sight isn't harmed. And then either it accents the amber or the gray or whatever that might be. There is a natural distortion in sunglasses that we count on, right? It maybe makes the sun not quite so bright, or polarized lenses that do that. But we live in such a way that we're looking through this lens and we don't even pay attention to the lens. Not at all. And so we think and we form ideas and we form our understanding of God and others and even of ourselves in light of that lens. And the thing that is clear to me is that the temptation of power is greatest when intimacy is a threat. And I'll say that again, and that's inspired by something that Henry Nouwen said. The allure of power is greatest when intimacy is a threat. So when our sense of belonging is threatened, not actually achieved, but threatened, is when our tendency to exercise power or control, because they're related, for doing that. And so one of the things that he said, and again, this this little book you can read in a half an hour, but it is supremely profound. And the thing that really convicted me is something he said about the fact that Christian leadership is exercised by people who don't know how to develop healthy, intimate relationships and have opted for power and control instead. Wow. Just wow. Because I have seen that. I've been in places, I have been in places of leadership, and the irony is that somewhere inside of me, it's always screaming, it's about relationship. It's about connection. It's about connecting with, knowing somebody. It's not about moving them to accomplish some task. It's about knowing them and maybe, in a sense, providing the motivation for something to change, which, by the way, is also a definition of grace. And so the thing that happens is that we see everything through this lens of power. And so we live in this kind of uneasy relationship with people, with God, with circumstance, with everything, with this lens of power, because there is no such thing as trust. You're well advised to trust conditionally. God is the only one that is able to be unconditional in his love for us. And so love translates into trust, right? And so he's the only one that can be unconditional because he sees all things. He knows everything about us, past, present, and future. He knows all of that. So for us, what we have done is we have reduced love to power because that is the safest place to be. Now, the more I thought about this, the more I recognized that there are at least 4 different ways that this shows up. And it shows up in positive. There's always a positive, sort of, and there's a negative. There's a dark side to it. Like, for example, the first one that I thought of was having power over someone. Now, the minute I say that, we think of tyranny and of abuse, of having total, absolute control over another person. On the other hand, if I'm the person with all that power, it provides me with safety because I am safely distanced from the person that I am trying to exercise power over. So power over can be safety for the person, maybe even safety for others, but it can also be what we tend to think of it as is power misused is abuse and domination and everything else, which takes me into the second one I thought about, and that was power against, which is domination, which is being manipulative, which is being controlling. It is making it in such a way that the person can't possibly say no, or there is severe, severe consequences, which is power against. And power against is only for the purpose of the person with the power, not the person without the power. It is not that. And see, we have so fundamentally embraced this as what you might call the coin of the realm, if you will. It's the way that we go about doing and trading things in our relationships, trading other people for ourselves, for our honesty, for all sorts of things. See, the very nature of trades is keeping the power equal. It's still about power. It's still about power. It's keeping things equal. Because the only way that will restrain power is equality. And let me say this, and I'll get back to it in a minute. We have confused power with authority. So those who have authority are assumed to use power incorrectly. And because of that, then, we have to control both. And so it's a form of power against the other person, resistance, and just pushing back and using the same weapon as that other person is using on us. So power against. And then another one I thought of, and I was on this roll of prepositions, power for. I mean, in a lot of cases, we're drawn oftentimes to what many people would refer to as activism or advocacy for what? Having the power is being an advocate for the powerless, right? So having power for, again, is trading in that commodity called power. It still is. See, this is the thing. It's always there in our relationships. Because from the very, very beginning, Adam and Eve were enticed with the power to be able to control their world without God in it. And that has been our temptation ever since. And it is so easy for things to degrade down into a struggle for power. And you can see that you look across the globe in so many different cultures, even some religions, that it is about who has the power, who is powerless, And how can the powerful take it from the powerless and use it to their advantage? So we can have the bright side, the upside, the light of power for as advocacy and protecting the powerless, but it can also be power for malicious measures, for maliciousness, for any kind of thing that would hurt others, okay? And then the last one, which is the last one, and I'm landing on it last for a reason, because we've gotten being power over somebody else. For some would be seen as power, as safety. For others, it would be looking like very much like power against, domination, control, etc. So power over, power against go together in a lot of ways, right? And then power for is this idea of, it could be advocacy and advocacy for those that are powerless, and a basis of protection for those folks. That's good. We're called to that. But we are not called to use that quote-unquote power. I would say that this is where the confusion over authority and power come in. But using that power against somebody else, for somebody else, instead of moving toward the relationship. Now, in the larger world, it might be called diplomacy, right? It's some kind of discussion and negotiation and things like that. The thing is that we're still trading. It's still the coin of the realm, power is. Because we don't want to take the time that it takes to connect with somebody in a measure of connection, of belonging and connection, and quite honestly, love. So the last one is having power with. Now, you might hear this called as power sharing. There are a lot of countries and governments in those countries, and they talk about it. Even in Israel, they have something they call a power sharing agreement. So it's sharing power with somebody. But again, we're always dealing with this inequity. And some of that, again, is partly because we've confused authority with power. Now, power with can be something very different, because having power with actually allows me to increase the power of another, to empower the other person. That's the word we get, right? Is to have power with. And having power with means I give something away, right? And so power with a person is actually the action of grace. Really. It's the action of grace. Because one who has power, God and Jesus Christ, has power, but they don't use it against us. They don't use it over us. Now, your concepts and framing of God may not be that way. I understand that. We don't see God's power, quote unquote, as something for us. But we are told, as now it makes clear, that Jesus literally gave up all of his power, if you think about it in that framing, okay, of God, Jesus having all the power of the Godhead, and then he incarnates, he captures all of that and puts it down into the body of a human. To do what? To empower humans. And that would be grace. We're told Jesus is a man full of truth and grace. Now, the other thing I want to put in here is just how pervasive this has become part of our language. As I have entitled this podcast, it has become the language of power. So relationships have within it the language of power, because we're trading one thing for another a lot of times. I talk to a lot of young people, and whether it's women or men, and they're trading something in order for something in return. So whether they're trading, they're being known in return for physical or emotional touch. They trade it. But trades are built on power. One person has something the other person wants, and you could say one person has a power over somebody else, and they say, I want you to give some of that up so that I can share that with you and be in relationship with you. But I will tell you this unequivocally, no relationship, no intimate relationship is built on power. It is not. And a story is told. I don't know if this is true. This may be completely legend. But a story is told, and I haven't checked it out. I'm going on a limb. If anyone knows, let me know. But the legend is, or the way of understanding, is that so many cultures, power is the commodity. And so being known is having power over somebody, which I talked about. And the person learns to hide their face because it is a means of giving power to another. Now, legend has it that in the Middle Eastern cultures, oftentimes men and women, men that had all of the power, okay, they had all the power over, they had all the power against, they rarely used that power for the people that were following them or they were in relationship. So men had all the power, and they would share that power with their queen, or whatever the commensurate term was in that culture. They would share that power with the queen, but never share sexual intimacy with that queen, because that is losing power. So what did that result in? They had concubines. They had a harem. That they lesser status, less powerful women that these men could have sexual intimacy with. They would not do it with their queen. Interesting, right? And so they shared power with the queen, but never gave her the edge. And again, this is all power-based language here. Never gave her the edge that she could use something against him to hold him hostage so he couldn't exercise the power that he believed was rightfully his. Okay? So that happens in relationships. It happens in marriage. Now, this is one of these places where I really run out on thin ice with hot skates. But I have a theory, and that theory is about this issue of power. And if you ever hear people fighting about being egalitarian, where both people in the relationship are quote unquote equal, we don't necessarily define equal in what, value, worth, power, whatever that might be. Or they fight. They accept and look to and actually look at Scripture with that lens. So egalitarian or complementarian, and complementarian by definition is willing to make the differentiation between power and authority. Because authority doesn't make one inherently valuable or more valued than another. And so complementarian is the idea that men and women have complementary roles. And in a lot of ways, I will be the first to say complementarian approaches and understandings within the church have led to some significant abuses in the church. Significant ones. And in marriage, I might add. The head of the household stuff. And so the issue is I think my personal little private theory, now it's not private anymore, but so be it. My own personal little theory is we have gravitated to the drumbeat of equality because we don't trust power, and the only way to control power is to distribute it and to make it equal. Only when there is 50-50 sharing of power, then each person is safe. And the thing that I want to say is, let's differentiate power from authority. Because authority that is justly connected to a larger authority and is learning from that authority will exercise that authority very, very differently than one who is bent on using the power that is theirs given to them by a higher power, and I say that intentionally, and then exercising that power in a relationship. And so we beat this drum about equality because our inherent distrust of power, but a abhorrent understanding of authority. Because if we're talking about authority, and we're talking about authority that is subject to a greater authority, then that authority is going to be exercised differently. And then roles can be complementary because it's people that are both highly, highly valued, have different gifts and abilities that complement the other person, and I'm not giving anything away because we think personal power is a zero-sum game. The more I gain, the less you have. And that has infiltrated, I think, a lot of our perspectives on marriage even. Now, I'll be the first to say there are compelling arguments on both sides of that side of that coin. Compelling, very compelling. But there is this undercurrent that has been there since Adam and Eve that the thing that we are fighting over is power. That's what we're fighting over. We are not fighting over cultivating the kind of relationships that there is trust. And so those are just two examples that oftentimes come up. I think you could also, which I'm running long on my time here, but I think you could also make a pretty good case in terms of our sexuality too. How we exercise our sexuality has been socially conditioned in a lot of ways and impacted by this lens of power. Now, the last one, which I want to spend a little bit more time on because it takes me into the final movement here, is our relationship with God. Because in a lot of cases, our relationship with God is a power relationship. It is not an authority relationship. We see God, and we have all the basis for it. It is in Scripture everywhere. But the people that are most in tune to this are saying, but God is omnipotent. He is all-powerful. Yeah, you're right. He is. Not debating that point at all. He proved it over and over again throughout history. But that has entered our calculations, particularly when things are going south in our world. That enters our calculation that now God is exercising his power because I don't trust his authority. Is he authoritative in our relationships? Yes, he is. As a matter of fact, there's plenty that he does or doesn't do that is not only because of his authority, but it's authority that is intertwined and interdependent on love. And we've never seen that. Most of us have never seen authority exercised in love because it's too vulnerable. Now, where does this take us? Because if you start taking this lens away, you begin to see how much of our very language itself is built on power and about power. It's about that. We think in power terms. And if you take that away, I think we end up feeling so lost, even though the very things that are the path out are the things that we love to rhapsodize about, like grace and love, for that matter. I think, again, this is just my own, the own craziness inside my own cranium. I think that that's exactly why Jesus was seen as such a radical, because everyone was expecting him to come in power, but he came in love. But all of his actions and all the things he said were seen through a lens of power. Therefore, because he didn't comply with the social conventions and the expectations and the Mosaic law and all of these other structures that were part of the culture in which he operated and was alive, they saw him as a revolutionary, as a radical, as someone that threatened the social fabric of society. If you listen to some of the things the Pharisees and Sadducees who were really about power, said about him, because they counted on the law giving the structure in the culture of the power to be who they were and how they were, and the power to make people come into line with the way they had seen things. So anything outside of that realm of being and thinking was a threat. And ironically, as Henry Nouwen makes very clear, that I mentioned earlier, is the allure of power is greatest when intimacy is a threat, which gives us a lens and gives us a way of looking at the absolutely mind-bending, remarkable nature of what God chose to do for us. Because he did not come in power. He came in love. And we only interpret it as power because that's all we've ever known and all we ever think about and how we think about things. So, as I said a minute ago, where does this leave us? I mean, what's the alternative, right? Because if we don't think with the lens or see with the lens of power, what do we do? And I've already hinted at it because of how God is. And what we've been told is God isn't emblematic of love. He isn't the image of love. He is love, which means that's his language. And we're interpreting what he is saying into our language rather than the language that he is using. And love and relationship go hand in hand with one another. So when I say in my classes so many times, trust and control cannot coexist, then the corollary of that is love and power cannot coexist. Because love and relationship go together. Which means what? It means cultivating an environment, relationships, other things, on trust. That doesn't mean I am completely vulnerable, and it doesn't mean I trust everybody. Not everybody has earned it. I mean, Brene Brown's got a great metaphor that I'll shamelessly steal from her, because she talks about that we have this big cookie jar that we fill with marbles of trust. And people who we have a full jar with them, then when they misbehave or they act in an unsafe way, I only take a few marbles out. I don't empty the whole jar. But yet there are lots of people that we keep putting marbles into the jar, hoping that they will be trustworthy, when they have given us no evidence of that whatsoever. And the problem is we end up feeling, which is key, we feel mean by not giving them our undivided trust, and they have not earned it. And so trust and control can't coexist. Power and intimacy don't go together. Neither one does. Now, there's a problem. There's a problem we all face. Because if we're going to move toward a different culture, a culture that's unique from the culture that we have to go out and survive in and deal with on a regular basis, that's the reality of the world that we live in. But the problem is what kind of culture are we going to cultivate? And the issue here is that in order to cultivate this kind of culture, it takes time. It takes a lot of time because we have to unlearn a lot of things with people that are equally as flawed and broken as we are. And they're going to make mistakes and they're going to blow it. And we'll have to get back in, quote unquote, the game and give it another shot with mutually accepting and mutually agreeing to do that. Now, not everybody does, and we have to be quick to understand and to see clearly the people that are expecting something from us, something they won't do themselves. They're entirely free to do that. But that doesn't mean that we have a relationship with them or a close relationship with them. I can still be civil. I can still be friendly, but I don't have to have a heavy, deep, and real relationship with these people. The problem is there are certain people in our world that we want that kind of relationship so much that we give away trust without them ever earning it. And there's no consequences when they blow the trust because it takes time to earn trust back. It's not on the person who's been hurt that has to earn the trust back. It's on the other person that has hurt them. And so it takes a lot of time. It takes emotional investment, which oftentimes we are very loath to make. Because if I put something in, I expect to get something in return. What does that sound like? It sounds like a trade, right? Well, it's legit. We work in this world. We want to know what our return on our investment is. But there is always risk. No matter where we look, there is risk. And where there's risk, there is failure. And if we say failure is intolerable and completely unacceptable, then we won't risk. We won't. And we won't make the investment, even though we may still have the expectation to get that without the investment. And then two more things. With this language of love, it takes patience. And patience is built on humility and a clarity of understanding about myself. I have patience with another person because I recognize in myself not only my need for patience, but also I recognize that the person I'm in relationship with, that's not condemning of them. It's accepting them as they are. And so it requires patience. Patience is not enabling bad behavior. Let's just be clear, okay? Patience is not enabling bad behavior or looking past or winking an eye or turning a blind eye to things that are really harmful. So it requires patience. And we see it, with adults that interact with kids. They have immense patience. Why? Because they know they're growing and they will learn. And if they provide them with the right environment, they will learn even faster and even more deeply. And the last but not least is grace. It's having a clear understanding of what grace is. Not it's giving somebody a pass to keep doing what they've always done and then say, oh, I'm just giving them grace. No. Grace includes accountability. Grace includes creating a space so the other person can learn and grow. Here comes the investment. That does not guarantee a return on that investment. But it at very least creates an environment for them to change and grow if they so choose, which they can. See, that's just it, is the rub of grace is that I have a desirable outcome for the other person, but they may not choose that. Is grace still operable? Is it still in operation? It has to be, really. I mean, if you think about our relationship with God and the grace that we are offered, it still operates, and that's why we have such a hard time with it, because it operates when we fail. We think we deserve it when we succeed, but it still operates when we fail. And see, all we do is we replace grace with shame and use it to change our behavior in the short term, and then around and around we go, and where we stop, nobody knows. So it requires grace as well. This language of love demonstrates a willingness for vulnerability and being known as we are. That's the language of love and relationship. It's living to live in the truth as it is, not as I want it to be. And that's where we go. That's learning to develop the language of love and connection and grace and belonging. And the list goes on. And, you know, when you look at even the fruit of the Spirit, it's all geared toward that very context or environment in which we can grow the best. Will we grow without those things? Yeah, we will. But it won't be the best that God is offering us if we cultivate this internal space that produces that kind of fruit, like self-control instead of other control. See, when I don't trust anybody, and I'm afraid of the power that they might have over me, then what will I do? Well, I will do just that. I will try to exercise power over and against and all of those things toward that other person. Now, there are very subtle forms of power, right? I mean, it's not always bludgeoning people into submission, but we've been operating, and it's been here for a long time, the context of power, because we haven't paid attention to how that comes into play. And that is part of what we have to try to change. And that's the image, in a lot of ways, that is the vision of what I have for Stained Glass International, cultivating what I said it at the beginning, right? An outpost for the heart. If you come into the outpost, that outpost, a new language is spoken, and that's the language of love, not the language of power. And that sounds idealistic. It sounds pie in the sky. I understand that, but that's the risk, I guess. And it's a risk that I'm certainly willing to take. I'm still growing into it. I have to make a conscious choice, just like everyone else that's listening to me has to make a conscious choice to allow someone to know me. And we're not talking about being extrovert or introvert at all. We're just talking about entering into a conversation with the attempt to inform the other person more of who I am at that time. Will it change? Of course it will change. That's kind of the interesting, exciting part of it, is that we will change. The worst part about that happening in our relationships is we grow complacent because we think we already know, and we can't. We have a hard enough time knowing ourselves, let alone anyone else. I mean, when you think about it, how many times have you heard somebody say, I don't know where that came from, a comment or a feeling or whatever it might be? So, lots of food for thought, I hope, because what kind of language do you speak in? Power or love? Invitation to trade or an invitation to connect? And I say that not to ruin your week. I say that because the only basis for change comes when we identify and are clear about what is going on around us and what it is we're doing ourselves. The Holy Spirit has an ample opportunity and a fertile ground to grow us by paying attention to what's going on in the contours of our own heart. And when we do that, we can move forward into the future with some measure of confidence, otherwise known as trust, of where God is taking us. So that's it for tonight. It's a boatload, I admit. It's been, like I said, it's been kind of rolling around my mind all week, and I was going to do another topic tonight, and I thought, no, I got to address this because it's just so profound and weighing on me in thinking about it. So that's it. If there are things that have come up in what I've said that you have questions or need clarification or other things of that sort, DM me on Instagram or on the website. You can put a question. We have a Q&A page there. You can ask questions. I'd love to hear your thoughts and reactions to some of this and how much this actually plays a part in your relationships and in your language and what you've seen. If you go to the website, it's drmitch.com. There's subscriptions there. You can subscribe, and anything new that comes up on the podcast, you'll be notified of. On that point, there is something new on the website that you may not know about, and that is that a few weeks ago I did a seminar, workshop, I don't know what we call it, but I had extended lectures, 2 lectures, not extended, but 2 lectures on shame and grace. It's a favorite topic of mine, and there is huge distortions and confusion, at least the way I see it, around shame. And I've heard lots of church leaders think that shame is a good thing and in my opinion, nothing good can come from shame. As we know it today and what we have done to ourselves today actually is very much connected into all that I've talked about in the last 50 minutes or something like that. So on the website, under presentations, I believe that's where it is. That seminar is up for video for you to take a look at and consider. It is all of the best of the stuff that I talk about with shame. The grace component of the grace lecture wasn't as full as I had hoped because I didn't have sound for some video clips that I worked from, and I didn't have that, and that made it a little tougher to teach from. But I think you'll get an idea of really, I think, the importance of these topics and understanding it, because as Christ followers, we have a profound antidote for the poison of shame, and that is grace. But we have to have grace rightly understood. Okay. Also, you can follow us on 3 different social media outlets where we can be found. Instagram, I can be found on the Psych Monologues. Facebook, ray.mitch. And LinkedIn, drmitch. All of those places you can find us. If you want to subscribe, I'd encourage you to subscribe. Easy for me to say. To subscribe for the podcast so you'll be notified every time a new one drops. You can do that on all the usual places that you might listen to podcasts. Spotify, Stitcher, I don't know how many people use Stitcher, iTunes, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, all those places you can find the podcast, Psych Monologues. So, last but not least, if you're interested, or if you're interested in partnering with us to continue to grow the scholarship fund for students of all kinds. It can be the alumni from CCU because they're the ones that are taking advantage of this, or other universities. You can partner with us through your tax-deductible gift. SGI, Stained Glass International, is now a tax-exempt organization, so your gifts are tax-deductible. And you can give to two different funds. One is to the general fund for Stained Glass International to benefit the development of resources and other things like that. Or you can give to the Silent Retreat Fund, which we very much need in order to make it doable and within reach to people that are just getting their career started. They don't have a lot of money to go to this thing. They may have to shoulder the expense of flying here to Colorado. So anything that you can give to help us in that regard would be immensely appreciated. If you prefer to do it in a physical check, we'll take those too. There is a donate button at the bottom of the page on drmitch.com where you can make a donation. It will give you the option to either give it to the general mission fund of SGI, or you can give it specifically to the silent retreats. We have 2 silent retreats coming up in April and May. And that is the big targets on our radar coming up that we need to raise funds for. If you wanted to support a single student to go on one of these silent retreats, it is $330. Just to give you a perspective, that's not easy for a college student who's trying to save money and go to school and work and everything else. So anything you give will be immensely appreciated. If you prefer to do a physical check, you can do that too. Make your check out to Stained Glass International. Address it, Stained Glass International, P.O. Box 160, East Lake, Colorado 80614. So prayerfully consider if you're interested in partnering with us. We would be ever so appreciative. This is targeting and trying to reach out to this generation of young people who have fled from the church because of the exercise of power. And that's why this thing has kind of lit a fire underneath me of late. So if you want to join us, you want to partner with us, we would be ever so grateful. Well, that's it for tonight. Thank you for listening in and taking some time out of your schedule to consider some of the things I'm talking about. And until next week, love ya. Later. Bye.